Are we live now?
We are live.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Go ahead and run the presentation. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Jeff Sugden, and I am a developer with OTS on Southern Storm. And go next slide, please. Okay, so I have framed this as not so much red teaming as X teaming, and the reason for that is that there are, I think, a lot more than just red versus blue. And in our pro version, we do civilians, which are white forces. The next thing is the green forces, which may be allies that you as a player may not necessarily command but have influence under. The next thing is yellow. And one of the things that we have done professionally was look at the notion of actually red 4 inserting deep recon teams under the guise of yellow forces. In other words, unidentified. And so that's an interesting thing to look at. And the last thing here is, and this is probably more important in our milieu, which is late Cold War, mid to late 80s, and that's the coalition aspect of it. And actually, you could probably extend that into the later on. In other, global war on terror, maybe, but certainly in generically, you have a coalition, and if you have a commander who's in command of a coalition, does everybody in the coalition behave the way you think they would? Next slide, please. So going back to our game, which is set in the late Cold War, this is kind of an interesting laydown. And what we're looking at is Northag and Centag during the Cold War, and looking at the doctrines of the various nations involved. And what you see is a dramatic difference in the U.S. doctrine as of the late Cold War with the introduction of air land battle doctrine, which is a very aggressive defensive doctrine. And those arrows going across to the right would represent attacks actually across the inter-German border. Another interesting aspect is to look at the fact that among NATO, there's no unified doctrine, right? So you look at nation by nation, and you see a mixture of area defense doctrine, mobile defense doctrine, and the U.S. offensive or aggressive defense doctrine. And the interesting aspect of that is at the sector boundaries. Now, one of the things to look at is that back in those days, the fights were not really run by NATO. They were run by the corps. And so each corps would execute their doctrine, and the problematic part is along the corps boundaries. So if you look at, say, for example, the Belgium doctrine in North Ag, which is an area doctrine, and area defense is basically an attrition-based defense, and you're denying the enemy to occupy a particular area. And you look to the north of them, they're on their northern boundary, you've got the UK that's doing a combination of area and area defense. So what's a mobile defense back then? Well, that was, you don't really have a reserve. What you would think about as a reserve is kind of defined as a strike force, and they know they're going to attack, unlike a reserve who doesn't know what they're going to do. A reserve will be like, they're uncommitted, they don't know what they might defend, they might screen, they might attack. But a strike force knows they're going to attack. And that was kind of like the central thing about the active defense was, you've got a portion of your force, to the rear, but they know they're going to attack somewhere. And that reduces the mission set, that reduces the preparation, and that helps those guys in that they can orient towards a particular set of tasks, as opposed to a reserve, which like it expands the mission set, the task list that they got to prepare for. The problem here is, because there's no unified doctrine across NATO at this point in the late 80s, is that you've got different forces fighting with different doctrines. So what does that mean? Well, it kind of gets into the style of fighting, and then you get into, how do you synchronize things along those those core boundaries? And so what are the mechanisms that let you synchronize things? And across a coalition, you have to kind of rely on doctrine to do that. And if the doctrine isn't common, then that kind of drives commanders to get on the ground in the particular spots that matter to synchronize things. And it just makes things more difficult. Next slide, please. All right. So I don't want to get into a whole lot of military theory. I don't want to get into a whole lot of military history, although it's fascinating. And if you're so inclined, please pursue that. I've got some links for a few documents that get into that. But let's lay down how you get to doctrine, right? So first, you got military theory, and you define your first principles. They're not universal, and they're very much culturally and experientially grounded. And it's a view, I will tell you, of a nation's perception of battle, right? And so, as an example, let's look at the Warsaw Pact, right? So you can go back to Napoleonic Wars, and their perception is that the northern corridor from like basically Hamburg to Moscow is basically flat terrain with no defensible terrain features. There's some rivers, but by the time you get to World War II, it's not hard It's not hard to cross a river. And what they learned from that was, if you defend in the motherland, there is a huge price to pay. Even if you win, there's a huge price to pay, because the recovery from the war, the economic damage resulting from the war is monumental. And I'll get into this a little bit later about looking at red teaming, but this is kind of like a foundational thing about Warsaw Pact doctrine, is you don't want to fight in Russia. You want to fight further west, right? All right. So you got your military, you get your military theory, and before World War II, there was a couple of competing military theories. One was, you need a big army, middleman army. And if you have a big army like that, what can you count on for troop quality? And it's, average guys, average leaders, and that kind of shape things. And that kind of goes to, Jomini and his outlook on military things, as opposed to Clausewitz, who is more of an artful theoretician. So you got your military theory. You have some concepts that kind of link up to the theory, but until they're tested and validated, they're just ideas. Once you get to the point that you have concepts that match up to the military theory, then you can get to doctrine, and really that's really how a force fights, and even beyond that, it's how you build your force, right? How it's equipped, how it's organized, and all of those kind of things. And that's the linkage between the theory and the reality of the battlefield. So in our game, what we want to do is we want to implement at least pieces of doctrine, and as we go along developing it, we get more pieces implemented and whatnot. So our view as a development team is that we take the accepted theory, test the concept, and you get doctrine. And then the doctrine leads to force design, which we implement in the game. And then additionally, behaviors, and the behaviors extend down to like company and platoon level, and even down to the crew and team level. Next slide, please. All right. So I know Steve Sallet had signed up for this, and is he here? Anyways, so here's the from the red team manual. Here's the four principle. Here's the four principles, right? So when you're going to red team, and I'm speaking from this as a game developer, semi as a content developer, but as a game developer, self-awareness and reflection. And the thing I struggle with is the groupthink piece, because in our game, usually, not always, but usually it's solo play. So I'm not sure, and here's what I'm asking for Steve to chime in here. Can you translate groupthink mitigation and decision support to a single player game? Now, fostering cultural empathy and apply critical thinking, those things, to me, in within the context of our game, those kind of like tie together. again, it's a single player exercise by and large. And the fostering cultural empathy, we don't want to have a game, because it's also a commercial game as well as professional. We don't want to have a game that kind of requires somebody to have a master's degree from PME, like, War College or whatever, CGSC or whatever. But I think you're well served as a player to understand the mindset that gets you to the doctrine of your opponent, or the doctrine of the side you're playing. And I think applied critical thinking applies, it applies to everything you do, really. I mean, you gotta, if you don't do that, in any endeavor, right, you're setting yourself up for the opportunity to fail. Next slide. Okay, so our design goals when we make the game is, the first thing is we want to have a credible look at how each of the nation's forces operate. And there's, on the NATO side, you got like 5 forces. On the Warsaw Pact side, well, you've got several nations, but one of the things, and it's kind of an offset, is that there is a unity of doctrine. So it's really kind of one thing. And we want to make it easy for our players to operate inside the doctrine. We don't want them to have to go study the doctrine to make it work. Another big thing is, in a lot of games, we'll spend a lot of time and a lot of effort in working at modeling the differences of the platforms and the weapons and the munitions. And we try to go a step above that and look at the human software systems, like communication networks, how does the fire support system work, and things like that. Next slide, please. Okay, so what tooling have we built in our game? Well, the first thing is the force structure. Now, there's a big asymmetry between the West and the East on this. In the West, there's a lot of ability to shuffle things around, right? And you can shuffle platoons around and create, across your force, combined arms companies, right? And that's really not the case in the Warsaw Pact, because you have to look at whatever it is the atom of combat power. And generally speaking, not in every case, but generally speaking, the atom of combat power on the Warsaw Pact is a company. The atom of combat power on the West is a platoon. And it gives the Western factions a bit more flexibility in tailoring the composition of their units, right, company level units and above, to the task at hand. We do strive very hard to respect the offsets. So there's different capabilities at all levels. And one of the things as a player is you have to understand what the offsets are, right? And the first thing that a lot of folks do is they focus on the offsets in terms of weapons and munition capabilities, sensor capabilities. But there's more to it than that. And if you're a professional, then you probably understand that. If you're not a professional, if you're a hobbyist, then that's a learning curve you got to deal with. We do put constraints on the player, and that's an outgrowth of, and I'll get to this later, of our experience with an earlier version of the game engine. And the last thing is that we have automated behaviors down at the unit level that the player may or may not be able to influence. Some things they can, some things they can't. And that relates directly back to the doctrine of the forces at hand. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to talk about, and as we go along, anybody has questions or comments, it's not a like hold your comments to the end kind of thing. Go ahead and sound off with them. All right, so the first case study is Red Army artillery in the attack, and I can't remember the gentleman that coined it, but artillery for the Warsaw Pact is the red god of war, right? And the way the Soviets looked at it, and when I say Soviets, that really means Warsaw Pact, because they ran the show, and there was one unified doctrine across the Warsaw Pact, which is an offset from NATO, right? So looking at an attack, you have 4 phases. You have the approach, which is unit moves out from the assembly area to get to the line of departure. Now, this is new since World War II. In World War II, it was just 2, 3, and 4 in this list here. By the time you get to the late 80s, I'm not sure when exactly they changed that, but by the time you get to the late 80s, which is when our game is set, the first phase is the approach. And cover, don't think of that as the Western cover mission, right? Just think of it as eliminating surveillance assets and possibly attacking C2 assets. So once they get to the line of departure, when you're talking about anywhere from 6 to 15 kilometers from where you're going to make contact, they will begin the preparation fire. This is a huge thing, right? And this kind of goes to the scientific approach to warfare that the Soviets had, and you can trace this back to Germany. So you had correlation of forces, and you had artillery norms, and so they would say, well, if you're gonna do division attack, we'll attack as narrow a front as 4 kilometers, probably a little bit more, but as narrow as 4 kilometers. But whatever it is, we're going to throw at least 100 tubes of artillery per kilometer of frontage. Now, that's also probably a kilometer deep, right? But it's a lot of artillery. Okay. The Soviets did this in World War II in the later phases, and they found that it worked, right? You throw this much artillery at a defense, it's kind of like you dig a shovel underneath a battalion battle position, lift it up about 50 meters and flip it over. That's what you get. And the Germans, in their AARs, said that's what happened, right? It was just like, tanks strewn around from the artillery fire. And they will throw, in that 4 kilometer space, a couple of 1,000 tons of ordnance. That was the calculations. And the idea here was like, we're going to, you do this and it's going to give you success, right? And a couple of thousand tons of artillery in that small of a, like, I don't care how deep you dig, you can't survive that, right? All right, so next thing is like, so this is against the front line battle positions of your objective, where the battalions are, where the enemy battalions are defending from, and now you want to do your attack, and so they would shift that back, they make a steel curtain of artillery, and what that does is it prevents reinforcement. It prevents escape of the guys in your objective. And you keep that up until you are on top of the objective. Then the last phase is the accompaniment. And at that point, then now you're going to say, okay, so here's the reserves. Here's the C2 nodes. Let's hit those. And I think that this is like the key difference between the style of fighting between the West and the East in this era. So the West, the US and the UK and the Germans, from their experience in World War II, signed up for the notion of fire and maneuver, right? The Soviets said, what works for us with our army, how we build it, is you fire, then maneuver. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is that the artillery creates the conditions for maneuver, as opposed to you maneuver and you use fires to enhance your maneuver, to help you maintain your freedom of maneuver, to cause attrition. And I honestly, I think that's like the essential difference between the two doctrines. Next slide, please. All right, so what's the difference between NATO and Soviet artillery, especially when we talk about how we do it in the game? So mass, that's the first thing, and the Soviets will mass artillery. That ties directly to their success in late World War II. And first, they'll mass artillery at the regiment level, which means they're going to pull the artillery batteries that are part of organic to regiments and put them under the command of the artillery commander. And then when they want to do a breakthrough, and that's a regimental artillery group, they'll do the same thing at the division level. And even when they're doing an advance to contact, and then hopefully an attack from the march, they will pull artillery from the following units, not just the point unit, but the following units, and pull them forward, and mass artillery even then. Now, NATO doesn't pull artillery. Okay, so you look at a NATO division, and they got a brigade, and they got 3 battalions, and each battalion is put out, supports a brigade and direct support, and those brigades, 3 battalions and direct support for brigades. Each battalion that's in support of direct support for a brigade splits out a battery per battalion. And basically, each maneuver battalion has got a battery of artillery on call to do what they want to do with it, right? And okay, go up one level, you got core artillery, and they got like 2 brigades. Each brigade's got 3 more battalions of tube artillery. Those get parceled out to the 2 divisions in the core, US wise. And you got a battalion of MLRS, and you got a battalion of Lance surface missiles, and those are nukes. So we'll take the nukes off the table for right now. We'll talk about the MLRS in a second. So basically, you've got an extra battery, per battalion, per maneuver battalion. So what does that mean? Well, usually what would happen is the Corps Artillery 2 battalions would be in general support. In other words, if there's more fire requests coming from one sector than the direct support battalion can handle, then it would get passed off to those guys, and they would shoot it. Sometimes they might be in reinforcing, which is like they're whatever unit they're reinforcing, they're just going to add more rounds to it. The MLRS at the corps level, the big thing was to track the Warsaw Pact chemical and nuclear platforms. And that's what those are dedicated to. And counterfires kind of fell down to the division, which had like 9 rocket launchers. So looking at the relationship between maneuver units and their supporting artillery, there's an asymmetry here, right? So for the Soviet, since the artillery drives the timetable of the assault cadence of the ground maneuver units, the maneuver units are responsive to the artillery. And in NATO, the goal was to shorten the response time for a ground maneuver unit calling for fire. So that means that ground maneuver maneuver unit commander was the focus of that. Next slide, please. So looking at core functions, the purpose of Soviet artillery was like basically blast a hole in the defensive line. And secondarily, to partition the battlefield so that the assaulting units could grab their initial objectives without molestation by any reserves. And the control, both the targeting and the timing, is in the hands of the artillery commander. So contrast that with NATO, it's a force multiplier for the maneuver forces. Right? It's adding some more lethality. And many, and I use the U.S. Army term battlefield operating systems. There's quite a few that exist only to, I won't say only to, but primarily to preserving the commander's freedom of maneuver. Air defense is one of those. Engineering is one of those. And it's not, and the whole thing is to give options to the ground maneuver commander. And the control in NATO is decentralized to the maneuver commander as opposed to centralized at the artillery commander. And there's some history on the Warsaw Pact side going back to 1941. Where in 1941 artillery units were scattered among rifle divisions and didn't work out so good for them then, in that terrain. And what they did was they centralized them and pulled them back further back. And the artillery units lived longer. And part of that was early in World War II, they used a lot of artillery units as anti-tank units. And that meant pushing them forward. But if there was a breakthrough, then it was catastrophic. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the game, when you want to talk about supporting fires, what we're talking about is a unit sees another unit and it triggers an opportunity fire opportunity, so that unit sends in a fire request to the engine, and it gets scheduled, right? And we put in an asymmetry because of the command relationship. So a Warsaw Pact unit that just sees somebody and wants to shoot it with indirect fire, it takes longer for that to happen, right? And it's like 8 minutes for an on-call mission versus 5 minutes for NATO. And we do note that the Czechs and the East Germans were a little bit better at doing that. We're on par with NATO. The next thing is that if you give a unit a series of missions, there's a delay between missions, right? And so for NATO, it's about the same as if you called for it naked. But for the Soviets, it takes longer. The other thing is that, well, if you want to do a long prep, the game mechanics allow you to do that without incurring a delay between, every minute more rounds drop down. So you could do a prep and it's going to like fall every minute for as long as you got ammo. And you'll note that that last sentence really talks about more in game terms. You're talking about if you do Soviet doctrinal density for a divisional attack, then you're talking about basically a battalion of artillery falling on individual hexes, which is a lot. Okay, next slide. So we have a responsiveness offset, and then we handle it with the mechanics in the game, but mostly it's driven by externalized data, right? So we've got Excel spreadsheets that define all kinds of stuff, and one of those, part of that is the artillery responsiveness time. And there's a range offset. The fact is, back in those days, Soviet artillery outranged NATO artillery, and they had more mass, and that's handled by the platform data. And then whether or not you have to deal with a mass offset gets into the content designer for particular scenarios. Next slide. Okay, so let's talk about task organization. And this is actually pretty nuanced. So on the NATO side, and we look at the U.S. model, and I lean on my experience, having been a mechanized infantry guy in a tank heavy brigade. The AMs are platoons, and back in those days, my company was cut over to a tank battalion. It swapped companies, and then my company was parceled out to platoons, right? So that ended up with essentially in that battalion 3 tank heavy company teams, 2 tank platoons and 1 mech platoon. Gets a little different when you get to a balanced brigade where you've got 2 mech battalions and 2 tank battalions. But I mean, the fact is, what you can do is you can say, well, what do I want to do, and you have a lot of latitude as a NATO commander to tailor your force composition, because you can swap platoons around. The Soviet model is a little bit different. It's more rigid. Okay, so you got regiments that have 3 battalions of the density. Tank regiments got 3 tank battalions and 1 motorized rifle battalion. Vice versa with a motorized rifle regiment, you got 3 motorized rifle battalions and 1 tank battalion. And they did not, by doctrine, swap things willy-nilly. It was a very kind of regimented distribution. So, like, the first thing was you work with pure battalions. The next level was, okay, so we're going to take our odd battalion and add those companies to the other 3 battalions. And they would fight pure. Companies would fight pure. The last stage would be, well, inside, after doing that, then inside each target battalion, we're going to take the odd company and split them up among the density companies. So you might have, a motorized rifle company with 1 tank platoon, or vice versa, right? And that's basically the limits of task organization options. Next slide, please. So we constrain the player to this. So how do we do that? Well, when we make a scenario, we say, here's your force. We don't let players split units on purpose at this point. And so it's kind of up to it's kind of like imposed by the content designer as to what level of combined arms you can achieve. Is you have combined arms companies, or you have combined arms battalions, or are you fighting pure? Now, we do have in our data set a platoon organized Warsaw Pact stuff. When would you use that? And one of the things to go back and look at the doctrine was, for the Warsaw Pact, their primary reconnaissance means was ground combat units. And if you look at the TONEs back then, the line battalions had no reconnaissance elements in them, as opposed to the West, where battalions have got scout platoons. So what does that mean? Well, what that means is, from the Warsaw Pact standpoint, you've got to take reconnaissance out of your combat power, out of one of your line companies. That was predominantly done either on the move or, on the move, both for flank and rear security. But the big thing was you're advancing to contact, and you designate a battalion as your advance guard. And so what that meant was, you're going to pull 1 company out of your unit. That's your forward security element. And out of that company, you're going to pull 1 platoon, tanker or IFV, depending upon what kind of unit you got. And that was called a combat reconnaissance patrol. It's essentially a heavy recon patrol is what it is. It's got combat vehicles in it. It's survivability, and it's got enough firepower to, if they run across an observation post, they can mow it down. When those guys go away for whatever reason, right, artillery or direct fire, then the Warsaw Pact will reconstitute those guys out of another company. As opposed to the West, who would have a recon platoon, and when the recon platoon's gone, it's gone, right? And having been in line companies and line platoons, I will tell you that on the West, we weren't trained to do recon tasks. So there's an offset there. And when we talk about offsets, we, you know, if you're from the West, you kind of have a bias that like the offsets are all on the West side. They're not, right? There's an artillery offset that's favored to the Warsaw Pact. There's a recon, I believe, you know, absent, you know, and the counterpoint to all this is that the Warsaw Pact didn't have armored cavalry, although, you know, the other NATO allies besides the U.S. didn't have armored cavalry, but they didn't have large formations dedicated to reconnaissance. And so depending upon the sector, you may or may not have an offset. Next slide, please. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, now we're getting, okay, so we've talked about at the battlefield operating system level, there's an offset that we model. Then at the next level, you know, we're talking about the organization of large formations is different. And then the last thing we're going to talk about here is behaviors. Now we're getting down into the, gosh, you know, the crew level, right? And the one I want to highlight here is the use of anti-tank guided missiles. And it was different, right? So you've got, on both sides, you've got dedicated ATGM platforms. You've got IFVs that got ATGM launchers, and you kind of think maybe like they shoot at anything they can see. And that wasn't the case. And it varied not just between nations, it varied inside of a nation among shooters and target types. And if you look at this, looking at the last, 20 years, you're going to get a false view of how things should work in the late Cold War. And one of the differences is in the late Cold War, heck, during the whole Cold War, right? So NATO's looking at an attacker that's got several tens of thousands of main battle tanks. And yes, some of them are old, but you know what? A T-54 against an APC is no contest. Doesn't matter, right? So they're valid platforms, and we see that today. They're rolling them out in Ukraine, taking stuff out of storage that's been in storage for what, I don't know, like 3 decades or something like that. So you can't look at Operation Iraqi Freedom or Global War on Terror in its entirety, or Syria or Ukraine, and translate that back to the late 80s and say that behavior should be the same. You can't do that. And I speak to that from having been a Bradley Master Gunner. You know, there was no command doctrinally. There was no command to shoot a missile at an IFV. There was one command for shooting a tow missile from a Bradley gunner missile tank. And why was that? Right? So there's like lots of tanks out there, and you kind of hope that you're going to last the whole war, which is going to last weeks, you got lots of tanks to shoot at. The other thing is that, how many missiles are in Germany in the ammo bunkers, and what's the rate that they can get them forward to resupply. So you were very circumspect about shooting those things. Now, in training at NTC and at CMTC at Hohenfels, as a squad leader, section leader, I had my guys shoot missiles at troops, machine gun positions, or a squad in a building. And I got lit up during AARs, right? And wasting a missile wasting an anti-tank missile at troops. I was like, well, okay, I could do that, or my squad's dead. What do you want me to do, right? Exception to the rule. Unlike Afghanistan, where it's like, well, okay, it's a PGM. I want to take out a machine gun position. I'm not worried about having to kill 30,000 tanks. We got plenty of missiles available. Okay, fine. It's a different thing. So, in our game set in the late 80s, we put restrictions that NATO, for NATO, ATGMs are largely restricted to tank targets, right? So what does that mean? Well, okay, if the unit is getting into like I'm going to die situation, then okay, they might fire an ATGM at something that's not a tank. That's basically what that means. And like I said, the constraints, you got lots of tanks. You only have so many missiles in your unit basic load, and you got to worry about can I get resupplied. And the West doesn't do echelon, unlike the Warsaw Pact. So it's not like I can fight and then when I'm done fighting, I'm done, and somebody else will take over. The guys that are on the border need to think in terms of lasting the whole war. Apart from personal survival, from a unit level, they got to last the whole war. That's not the case for the Warsaw Pact. Next slide, please. Okay, so now on the Soviets, right? There's an offset, and the biggest offset is tank versus tank, honestly. And beyond about 2,500 meters, the Soviet tanks are much less effective than the NATO tanks. Okay, not German and US and UK. So you got a range offset right there. Now, not every ATGM, but a lot of their ATGMs are better in performance, both in penetration and in time of flight than the Western ones. And so you got the Metis, which is about, it's a 1,000-meter ATGM, and it flies about twice as fast as the Dragon, which is, another 1,000-meter, Western 1,000-meter ATGM. And the Concours has longer range and faster flight time than a TOW. So there's that. And, oh, by the way, they made fast ATGMs that could be shot from a tank gun. And not just a tank gun, but the tank guns that were used for towed and anti-tank guns. But they got a 1 million man army, right? And so with a 1 million man army, you got a lot of average Joes. And you can't afford to train them to a higher proficiency compared to the West. And so what they did with these ATGMs that you could shoot from a tank is they gave them to the platoon leaders. They're in the platoon leader tanks. And they weren't used against tanks. What they were used for was killing tows and Milans and HOTS. So that also meant that they would shoot them at IFVs. So you have an asymmetry there, which causes some consternation in the civilian market. You know, like they're shooting my IFVs and my IFVs aren't shooting their IFVs with missiles. Oh, okay. Yep, you're right. They don't. So what we've done is we said, well, okay, if you get to 1,000 meters, now you get into a self-preservation mode, which I will tell you it's understandable. And you know, once somebody gets to 1,000 meters, you're gonna throw everything, including the kitchen sink, at them, right? The Soviets, however, can shoot anything at any range with an ATGM. And what we're talking about really is we're talking about tanks and IFVs. If the IFV's got a missile launcher. Also, didn't mention it here, but also if you have a ground mount ATGM. And the constraint here is that the player can't change that. They got to live with it. Next slide, please. All right, so this is an interesting thing. So I joined the team after being a player of the previous edition of the game, which is Flashpoint Campaigns Red Storm, and did a lot of interaction on the forum, and one thing that I found was players struggling playing the Warsaw Pact, and the problem that they had was they were trying to play the Warsaw Pact like they had NATO equipment. We do not have any magic in the code that says, well, you're not following the doctrine, so you get penalized. And it's kind of organic. You know, we build the stuff from the bottom up, and then we look at and then we check to make sure that it makes sense, you know, for how we perceive folks would fight during that time period. And if there's a mismatch, then we try and figure that, you know, where the mismatch is. What we found was, like I said, if you try to fight the Warsaw Pact, not the way the Warsaw Pact force was designed to fight, it's an uphill battle, right? And once we guided players to say, well, you know, you might want to look at doing this like that, then they sort of have more success. And basically it was, you got to close the range band. You can't do a tank duel at 3,000 meters and win. You got to get to 2,000 meters, then you're pretty evenly matched. And we view that in terms of, you know, what I'm calling X-teaming, which is fighting according to the doctrine of the force that you're portraying. You know, I think it's a good thing. Next slide, please. Is that the end?
Yep, I believe you hit the bottom there, Jeff.
Okay, so comments and questions? Okay, for a hobby wargamer, how do you recommend players use Flashpoint Campaigns Series, learn Soviet doctrine? How do we fight in a telephone booth? Okay, so a couple of things. One is you have to go back to look at how the Soviets used artillery, right? And here's a challenge: like, how do you know where to shoot your artillery, right? And we kind of get fixated on, I think, as players, shooting at things we see. You don't need to shoot at things you see. Shooting at places where that's a good place to set up is absolutely the right thing to do. Okay. So as a Soviet player, you got to look at like, okay, I'm going to go through here and look at your route, look at the objective, and go, wow, here's an area where it would be a really good place if I was, this is kind of like, you got to red team it, right? You got to red team the NATO. And that's why I don't like red team, because it drags a whole baggage car full of baggage that makes you think, your enemy. And it makes you think, it makes you think bad guys, right? If you're quote the bad guys, your red team is the blue guys, right? So, ditch that paradigm and think about it like you gotta think in terms of your opponent, right? And so if you want to go up this road and there's a town in the middle of it, and then there's another open space, and then there's your objective. So what do you got to do, right? You probably need to hammer that town, then blow by it, and then think about, like, when I get to the open space that's really close to my objective, where are good places to shoot from, right? And then put artillery on them. And you don't need to kill guys. That's always good, right? You don't need to kill everybody, but if you cause some casualties, apart from causing casualties, you're going to cause degradation, right? You're going to disrupt them. In game terms, you're going to lower their readiness, and it's going to affect their ability to hit you. The other thing is that you kind of think of like, well, okay, NATO's got thermal sensors, right? Second offset. And that's true for the combat vehicles, but it's not true for the dismounted troops. So obscuration is definitely a thing to do. It'll cut the killing power by like 60% of a mechanized platoon, because the dismounts can't see crap in the smoke. And if your defender has M113s, that means nobody can see anything, right? If your enemy is M1s and M113s, the only guys that can see through smoke are the M1s. So there's that. Use smoke. Even if you got tanks and Brads, use smoke, because the machine guns in the squads are going to slice up your dismounts. And that matters. Besides reflecting on different doctrine, equipment, and training implications, do you think a WEGO system inherently tends to force players to red team their opponents? Oh, wow, that's loaded. Let's unpack that. Well, I think the WEGO system encourages you to continually red team, right? Because and the WeGo system means that you put orders in and you have so many minutes until you can put orders in again. And in the beginning, you both sides put in the same orders. Both sides can put in orders at the beginning of the game. And as the game proceeds, the amount of time between the opportunity to put orders in changes for each side. And it depends on a number of factors, like electronic warfare level is like the primary thing. The next thing is, what's the state of your chain of command? And if your chain of command is beat up or tired, then it takes longer until your decision cycle gets longer. All right. So I don't know if it's red teaming from a standpoint of course of action analysis. All right. That probably is mostly front loaded before you even give your first order. If you're playing against a human, maybe. If you're playing against a human and you think you've broken their plan, most definitely, right? And that's part of the art of being a commander is to understand when when your opponent is on the cusp or has passed the cusp of you broken his plan. What's he going to do next? What's his contingency? Right. So there's that. Sure. I don't know that it's necessarily an outcome of WeGo. It certainly gives you different opportunities at different points as opposed to like you go, I go kind of thing.
I'm going to jump for a couple points here too. Want to go back to Zachary's question. Another point to that, getting into the phone booth to fight, is terrain masking. On top of Jeff's points of hammer obvious points with artillery, take approaches that provide the best masking, that don't put you in those long open terrain points where you can get hit with long range fire. That may be having to go around a hill, use some forest, try to close that gap. Another thing in our game, keep an eye on the weather. If it's raining heavily, that degrades sensors and allows you to close. So you might be able to make more of a dash towards your objectives when the weather's bad. So there's those points. Jumping on the WeGo question, planning in any game is probably a good move. We've done a number of our staff exercises at Origins where you plan out, look at the course of action, do your red teaming, look at the enemy course of action. It helps, and I think it'd probably help in any game. I think it shines more in the WeGo because of that. You have to think ahead. You've got to put your orders in. There's going to be a time where your units are doing their own thing as you've planned. And if you've thought it out effectively and understand what the enemy is and what his intent is, you're going to come away with a better battle. If you're just in there moving units and kind of hitting it willy-nilly here and there, you're probably going to have a bad day because you're going to either put your force in a bad location, have something in your command cycle that's broken, because you've moved out of a headquarter range, not placed your support units like artillery, supporting the right areas and timing. So I think WeGo is the better place to have that more realistic command, and via that command have to go through and plan. And I'll let Jeff take over any other questions from there.
I want to comment on use of terrain. So, like from a defense, right? NATO defense, you kind of get sucked into the notion of I want to get to the terrain that lets me see the furthest. and I want to shoot tanks and tows out to the max engagement range. That's not always a smart thing to do, right? And the reason being because of mass, right? So once you shoot, everybody who's on the board that has a line of sight to your location, that unit's location, is going to see that unit shoot, right? And it's like shooting up a red star cluster that says "shoot me," right? And going back to my service days, it's like, well, no, you don't do that. What you do is you try to use terrain to partition the battlefield, whether it's a slope, downrange at 2,000 meters, so that you can pick guys off as they crest that slope, or you're behind a ridge line and you're actually shooting guys as they drive by and nobody else can see you, right? So the amount of fire you can receive is diminished by using terrain masking as in a defense. And that's just like going back to FMs in the mid 70s, like, here's how you do it, right? And it works.
Then we'll see if we have any other questions.
Yeah, I'm way open. I thought Jan would ask something. I don't know if he's here, but he signed up.
I think Zach was saying he had to run something else at this time slot.
Oh, okay. Is Steve here? Steve Sallet.
Sorry, he's the one that's running something.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, Jan was in the Discord chat, so he may still be here listening. So we can give folks a couple minutes, and if that's everything, we can roll off and get some dinner.
You want to ask a question already? Okay. All right. I guess we can close down.